Okay, so, ladies and gentlemen, very welcome. Professor Pinault, Georges Pinault, is a professor of linguistics at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris. He is one of the leading experts on Toharian languages and has published more than 200 articles on Indo-European linguistics. He's one of the editors of the Journal of the Toharian and Indo-European Studies. His major fields of research are Indo-European linguistics, especially in Indo-Iranian and Toharian, the languages and manuscripts from Central Asia, especially the Toharian texts, and the Vedic philology and Indo-Aryan linguistics. That was my short introduction, and now I would like to ask you, Professor Pinault, to give your talk.
Okay, many thanks for this kind introduction. First of all, I express my gratitude to Professor Jens Peter Laut, an old friend of mine, and to the members of the Seminar für Tautologie und Zentralasienkunde der Universität Göttingen, where I had a chance to come and to work. So it's a great honor for me to take part to this series of lectures. So, and then I thank also Dr. Martin Ver and Mustafa Afshar for their support in the preparation of this lecture. So then I will basically follow my handout that you all receive, and the background is of course Tocharian itself. As you know, Tocharian is a misnomer, but I will go back to that in a minute. But Tocharian, or German Tocharisch in French Tocharien, is an independent branch of the Indo-European language family, represented by two different languages, different, albeit closely related. So these languages were spoken and written in the Tarim Basin in the Xinjiang province, China, roughly during the first millennium Common Era. That's enough for the purpose of today. Tocharian languages, you see, are documented by manuscript number 2, found in the oasis of the trade route on the northern edge of the Taklamakan Desert, so the northern part of the Silk Road, if you want, roughly between Tashdar and Rami. That will be the two extreme points, in my view, see, according to our present-day documentation. But there were, on this northern route, 3 major areas, from west to east: Kucha, first Kucha, second Yenki, alias Tarasha, and Turfan. The manuscripts are dated from 4th century Common Era for Tocharian B, and from somewhat later, from 7th century onwards, for Tocharian A. Tocharian B was the vernacular language in the whole era and only prevalent in the west around Kucha and further west up to Tumshuk and maybe even up to Tashdar. Tocharian A manuscripts have been found only in the middle spot, Yenki, alias Tarasha, and in the eastern spots around Turfan. The date of the extension of both languages is unknown, but this extension was probably related to the demise of the Buddhist culture, first in the West, and the progressive adoption of the Old Uyghur language by the inhabitants, then probably before 13. So the extension, I would assume this is that it took place before the 13th century Common Era, but manuscripts have been copied probably until 11th century Common Era, according to the present-day documentation, of course. The majority of Tocharian B and Tocharian A scriptures consist in texts of Buddhist contents, canonical and para-canonical text, translation or adaptation of texts in Sanskrit or earlier in Prakrit, that is Middle Indic. But there is a significant number of profane manuscripts that document mostly in Tocharian B, but some also in some, a few in Tocharian A. The whole Tocharian literature was much influenced by the Indo-Buddhist culture imported by missionaries coming from the West, that is from Gandhara, and affiliated to the Sarvastivada and Mula Sarvastivada school. The Tocharians have adopted the book format called Pustaka, alias Pothi, and the Brahmi script, also important from Northwest India. So this variety of the late Gupta script actually is called North Turkestan Brahmi by Laura Zander, and you will. I give one reference here, but of course she published many papers on the paleography of Sanskrit, of Totanisaka, and also of Tocharian. But this North Turkestan Brahmi has been used by the Tocharians and with adaptation to the phonology of Tocharian language, and a later variety of it, see, there are basically two varieties, you see, but has been adopted by the Uyghur to yield the Uyghur Brahmi script. See? So that also, you see, these facts are also evidence for contact between Tocharians and Uyghurs, see, from the point of view of book tradition. Now, it is relevant here to say some words about the names of the two languages, because for this issue, the Old Turkic sources are crucial. The two Tocharian languages were known by the Uyghurs under two names that are attested in the colophons of two major words, about which I will speak later. You see, the Maitreya Semit Nambiti and the Dashakamapata Avadana Mala. The language A was named Torre. See, so of course that is here you see the Uyghur, the spelling in the Uyghur Sogdian script, or the Uyghur script based on Sogdian script. And F. Veta Müller and Emil Z, you see at the eve of the Tocharian studies, you see, have related this word to the name of well-known name of people called the Tukara, Great Tochari, Latin Tukari, Chinese Tuwolo, and so I will not insist on that because this was mistaken actually, and because it has been shown since that the Tushan rulers, so-called Indo-Scutan, you see, adopted as official language Middle Island language, which is known Bactrian, because now we have sources, definitely crucial sources about the Bactrian language itself. There has been contact between Bactrian and Tocharian, certainly, but there is no Tocharian substrate in this language. So the Beja and the Tushan, see, were not Tocharian speakers, you see. Okay, so then, concerning the form of the name, you see, the name is not really Togre, but rather Togre. See, but see that has been shown by Henning. But of course, that's well known, you see, but that's in all bibliographies, you see. And but this word, you see, that is a kind of puzzling, you see. This word is not Totarian itself, you see, cannot be Totarian, this word Todre, because Totarian did not have voice stops. So the source of this name, you see, should be external, see, to Totarian. And actually, the indigenous self-designation of Totarian was Archi. That is absolutely certain. And so they named their language the Archi language, their country the Archi country, and that corresponds to Agni Desha. See, Agni looks Sanskrit, but it may be pseudo-Sanskrit, see, that is the Sanskrit interpretation of a local name. Okay. Second, the B language, according to the colophon, is Oku, or rather Ogu, Kusen. Okay, not Kusen. Kusen is confirmed by Mahmoud al-Tashdari. So it was a dental, voiceless sibilant, Kusen. So most probably, you see, this designation, you see, corresponds to indigenous name, you see, that is in Totarian Bay, Kushin or Kushinier. So I have commented that in a former paper, so I will not dwell longer on that. Again, there are several variants of this name, Kushi, Kuchi, that is maybe a Sanskrit version, you see, of the local name, but this local name, according to the Chinese transcription, you see, had also various forms. See, that can be Kutsi to Chi. So I will not enter into this intricate issue. Okay, but that's the ancestor, you see, of the present name. Kucha, actually Kuche, see, since Mongol time. But the former form ended definitely with an I. So we don't know what means Oku, but Oku cannot be really properly Turkic, I think, you see. Okay, so one can read also Ogu, you see, that's impossible to tell. Okay, but the complete name, you see, according to the Uyghurs, you see, was Ogu Kusen. So, but that's quite significant. See, that the Uyghurs, you see, were absolutely able to differentiate between these two languages, and these two different languages were assigned to different regions. See, because the Fort Todri region, see, comprises Turfan, or Kocho, Beshbalot, and Yenki, but not Bucha. See, that's for sure. Okay, now I come to that are kind of prerequisite, see, because we do find these names in colophons, precisely of the two major works of the first phase of Uyghur Buddhism that are been translated from Totarian. So the Totarian name Maitreya Samitinataka, Rama Odri Totar with Maitreya. See, we have a huge text, you see, in 27 acts, see, or section, you see, that was very popular and known by at least 5 different manuscripts, discovered each around 300 Pustaka leaves. And it was translated without any intermediary as Old Widow Maitreya Simit Dambiti, Test of the Law about Maitreya Samiti, which has also 27 chapters and a long prologue. Each chapter covers around 15 Pustaka leaves. There are two versions, which presuppose a common archetype, the so-called Turfan, actually Sendim and Murtut. Murtut is older version, and Rami version. Rami order, now Tumurti order Nernasi, if I name the atoll spots, find it spots, you see, which are near Rami alias Kumul. So the Tocharian A test is based on a compilation or combination of previous texts in Sanskrit. There was certainly never such a let's-start work in Sanskrit itself, I believe. So, and it was framed in a complete narrative with Maitreya, the future Buddha, as protagonist. So it has definitely a plan. See, it tells the career of Maitreya first as Bodhisattva, Brahmin student, then Bodhisattva, and then as Buddha, following the classical career of Buddha. This text, on the formal, of the point of view of literary genre, see, shows the interchange of prose and verse, which is usual in Tocharian narrative and dramatic text. As for the narrative, that is the so-called Champu styles, which were used for the literary versions of Avadana and Jatakas. The term Nataka, drama, in the title of this work does not correspond adequately to the present shape of the text, which is not very different from an elaborated narrative. So, but that's another question, is the question how this work was ever performed. Personally, I believe that this text was the basis of performance, see, at the occasion of the feast of Maitreya. But that is an older hypothesis, you see, by Anne-Marie von Gabin and others, but I think that is basically correct. But probably it is not exactly an Nataka according to the rules, see, of Indian dramaturgy, you see, as elaborated by Bharata, the classical treatise, you see. And, okay, but the major difference, you see, is that the old Widow Maitreya Simit left out, you see, of course, the contrast between prose and verse. Maitreya Simit Dambiti is entirely in prose and does not translate the dramaturgical indication occurring in the Tocharian A text. See, that appear at the beginning of the end of each act. But nevertheless, you see, the old Widow text renders the direct speeches, which are quite numerous, you see, of the various characters who feature in the narrative. So one can definitely see, you see, when direct speeches begin, because they are introduced by a verb of speech, as in Tocharian, you see. The Tocharian A text put the whole matter, you see, in the canvas of the destiny of Maitreya, the future Buddha, but it was basically an encyclopedic text, you see, inspired by didactic trends and designed for disseminating a lot of teachings of the Buddhist doctrine according to the Sarvastivadin school. See, the text is definitely of Sarvastivadin inspiration. It has also some Mahayanist traits, but of course that remains also to be investigated in depth. Now, there are colophons at the end of the section, actually sub-colophon, you see, and each act or chapter has a name that corresponds to a major event of the narrative. In the Tocharian A text, these titles are borrowed from Sanskrit, see, with some adaptation to Tocharian phonology, whereas in the Old Widow text, they have been systematically translated. That is that's interesting, and that corresponds to the general trend of this translation, you see, because the Old Uyghur translator made his best, you see, to make the whole matter understandable, you see, by the audience. The audience was Old Uyghur nobility, probably seen Old Uyghur elite and lay followers of Buddhism. You see, first in the region of Yenki, alias Tarashar, and possibly also later in the Turfan region. The Tocharian A colophon states that the work has been composed by Arya Chandra, this is called Vaibhashika, was from the Sarvastivadin school. The Old Uyghur colophons are very interesting because they give additional information about the transmission process. The model was composed from the Indic language. In the Tocharian language, by Arya Chandra, the same person born in Al-Nidesha, that is also told. See, and it was then translated from the Torah language, you see, into the Turkilinche language by another person, you see, another monk probably, see, and poet, see, Prajna Rachita. The Tocharian verb writ, causative, you see, to arrange, combine, compose, create, is made by Old Uyghur Yarat, and which is itself the causative or the fatitive, if you want, of Yara, and that corresponds semantically very well. So, but you see, there is a strong distinction made between compose and translate. Okay, then, okay, now I come to the Dasha Kamapata Avadanamala, which is also a huge text, which has a definite structure, you see, garland of legends pertaining to the 10 courses of ancients. And this translation was elaborated in mid-10th century, somewhat later than Maitri Simindam-Piti, at least for the so-called Turfan version, and copies made until 12th century isolated. So this text has been edited by Jens Wilkens, and also he has also given the full catalog, you see, of the manuscript in 2010. So it is a collection of exemplary legends gathered in cycles according to the successive 10 Karmapata. So I will go back to the Karmapata later in my lecture, and it's inserted into a frame story. So that is clearly influenced by Indian genre, you see, the genre of the frame story, but here, which is used, you see, for teaching and edifying purpose. Now, it remains to be seen how much, you see, the style is common to the Maitris Treya Samiti Nataka and the Dasha Kamapata Avadanamala. See, both from the Tocharian point of view and also from the Old Uyghur point of view. So, but that can be the basis of literary investigation, you see, that are required from my point of view. And the colophons of the Dasha Kamapata Avadanamala state that the word was translated by Sangha Dasa from Tocharian B see, Odu Tusen into Tottarian A, and again translated by another person, Sheila Sena, from Tottarian A into the Turk language. So that is Old Uyghur. So that is clearly stated. Then now in the recently, in the recent past year, it has been confirmed by the identification, you see, of fragments, unfortunately only fragments, you see, in Tottarian A as well in Tottarian B. Fragments which contains parts of Avadana, you see, that are parallel to parts of the Dashakamapata Avadana Mala. So it is now certain, you see, that the original version was in Tottarian B. So probably there was never a full Dashakamapata Avadana Mala in Sanskrit. See? So one has to accept, you see, or surmise, you see, that this work has been first composed in Tottarian B, of course, on the basis of translation of Avadana, were, of course, translated themselves from Sanskrit, but they were separately translated. But the idea of a whole work, you see, of this compendium, you see, maybe has been elaborated in Tottarian itself. But that remains also to be definitely proved. The difference, you see, is that we do not have, you see, in Tottarian colophons, you see, of this word, and the title of this word is not known in Tottarian itself. Now we have other evidence, you see, for contact between Uyghurs and Tottarians, you see. Number 10, there are Old Uyghur interlinear glosses in Brahmi, inserted in Sanskrit, Tottarian A and Tottarian B manuscript that has been ably surveyed by Dieter Mauer. And all these pieces, with some exceptions, which I will return, have been found in the Turfan era. Kocho, Sendi, Murtu. The text pertains to the various genres of Tottarian literature. Of Buddhist content, you see, that is Vinaya, Sutra, Abhidharma, canonical as well as para-canonical. And so that testify to the close contacts of Uyghur Buddhists with Tottarians that copied Sanskrit and text in their own language, Tottarian A and Tottarian B. And it shows also the interest of the Uyghurs for different Buddhist genres, see? And particularly interesting is the fact that they also made extracts, compiled extract and keywords from the Dirghagama, you see, of Sarvastivadin or Mullah Sarvastivadin school. And this practice is also known independently in Tottarian. So certainly the Uyghurs have learned this practice, the Uyghur Buddhists, you see, have learned this practice from the Tottarians. Now, another quite interesting piece, which is actually unique, you see, but that's certainly representative of a larger corpus. It is a bilingual, Tottarian B, Old Uyghur bilingual in Brahmi script. See, that is Uyghur, see under number 11, you see Uyghur 5208 and 5207. Is written on the verso of the Chinese scroll. So that is some kind of working text for pedagogical purpose, kind of exercise, translation exercise reflecting the educational process of Uyghur translator. And it has the Tocharian B parts, you see, do not make a continuous text on the majority, but they have a strong Indian flavor, you see. So that reflects extracts from a literary, Tocharian B literary text. Okay. This text, the Tocharian part is certainly older than the Old Uyghur part, layer, you see, which may belong to the late 10th or early 11th century. So, on the whole, as you can see, all the texts which I have discussed so far belong to the first phase of Old Uyghur Buddhism, between the 9th century and the 11th century. Now, I will discuss in more detail, you see, the onomastic, the Old Uyghur onomastic, to see the proper names that are found in the colophons of chapters of the Maitreya Samiti Nataka, and that gives the definitive evidence. It has been already commented on by Yukio Kasai. You see, they were definitely Old Uyghur donors, you see, and sponsored copies of Tocharian manuscript, and especially of the Maitreya Samiti Nataka. Which is, it is quite fortunate, you see, that we can, in several cases, compare the Tocharian colophon to the Old Uyghur colophon, see, of different chapters that shows some differences, you see, as I observe immediately, you see, for instance, the colophon of the 4th chapter, you see, you can read by yourself the translation, you see, and which is quite interesting here, you see, that we do have, or we can easily reconstruct, you see, the parallel Tocharian text. So the parallel Tocharian text had as title, as name of this chapter, you see at the top of page 5, Abhishet, that is from Sanskrit Abhisheka. So the Old Uyghur text has Abhishet, but also it has a translation, kind of a gloss of that, you see, in the form of Tedun Uge, Thronfolder, Narfolder, which corresponds to Tocharian A compound, you see, which does occur in the text itself, but not in the colophon. See, okay. Then I now come to the proper names, you see, of the donors, you see, of the Buddhist lay followers, you see, that were donors of this manuscript. So we do find in that case, you see, a long list in the Tocharian text, see, A302, on the line B8, and you see, it says, you see, the 12 brothers, starting with Prashantasena, which has obviously, you see, a name, a religious name, you see, borrowed from Sanskrit, the chief of the family, Kulapaka, together with their sisters, ordered to copy this book. So this mention of brother and sisters appear also in other manuscripts, you see, and in general, the family relationship, you see, were quite important, quite significant for the Uyghur donors, you see, and that certainly was a model on a previous totalitarian practice. You see, but to make this story short, you see, the merit of writing or letting write, you see, ordering the writing, the copy of a manuscript, extends to the whole family, see, brothers, sisters, and also, even in some cases, to the ruler. See, there is evidence for that in old widow colophon. You see, so then, and also definitely in some cases that are documented, to deceased person. See, okay. Then, see, from the onomastic point of view, it has been already observed, you see, that several of these names are of Turkic origin. But I will insist on the following point that have been really never really commented or discussed. See, some of these names, which all belong to all Uyghur donors from the nobility, you see. Some of these names are definitely Turkic, but some are not Turkic, but are Tokharian, see, and or are influenced by Sanskrit. Some are also from Iranian origin, from Sogdian, some from Chinese. So there is really multifarious sources of these names. But on the whole, we see that reflects the fact that that is families, you see, of all Uyghur donors, see, used names of different sources, maybe effectively, because of alliance between clans. You see, some of these people in a large family were closer to China, or they found fashionable, you see, to use names of Chinese origin, but it is quite striking that they also found fashionable to use names of Tokharian origin, names of titles, you see, of Tokharian origin, and also names of Sanskrit, ultimate Sanskrit source, through Middle Indic, and also through Tokharian. So here I give some example of that. You see, Tarmots and Parnots are definitely Tokharian words, you see, that means glorious and righteous, you see, so in Sanskrit, Dharmika or Dharmiya. So that's absolutely appropriate in a Buddhist context, see, and that belongs also to the Tokharian phraseology. So, and then the suffix itself, you see, ots is for ons, which is quite commonplace phonetic development in Tokharian. Also, wam, you see, is probably, I believe, from, I propose, from ultimately from Sanskrit Bama, but via Tokharian, you see. Bama, light, brightness, splendor, you see, and which was used to, of course, to name a woman, you see. See, the name of these women, you see, these noble women, refer often to brightness, you see, to flowers, you see, to all sorts of positive qualities, you see, that can be found, you see, that can be found in the Old Turkic onomastics, of course. But here it is interesting to see that there are some forms that are definitely of Sanskrit origin. For instance, under number 13, you see, I discuss but the names are partly the same, you see, in the fragment 303. Then here we have, we have Sherry. Sherry, I think that is relatively straightforward to explain Sherry as the Turkey transposition of Middle Indic Shiri, corresponding to Sanskrit Shri, which is used, this is commonplace, you see, for naming persons, especially women, in Sanskrit. Okay, so then then of course, see, the titles like Khatun, see, or are commonplace, you see, and so that's not that's so original. But for instance, you see, there is this name written Kuten. I believe that is from Kut, it's based on Kut, which is commonplace in Turkic onomasties, you see. For instance, it's a form Kuklun, but here it is, the basis is Turkic, but with a Totalian suffix, N. See, there is no way to explain that, to explain this form, purely in Uyghur terms. So here we find a linguistic mixture, you see, of the old Turkic onomastic basis, you see, with other components that are borrowed from Tocharian. Okay, this number 14 now in my handout, page 6. This fragment, you see, the letter fragment A303 has some things that are in common with the leaf A311 from a different manuscript. You see, all these belong to the Berliner Torfan-Sammlung, of course, which contains things of introduction or conclusion to Buddhist text. See, and here it says, you see, you can read the translation. Therefore, we have copied with joyfulness. May we come indeed to Maitreya. I think that's a very frequent prayer. And then it says, you see, the good ones have taught to us the merit of writing the law of the Buddha Lord. Among all merits, this merit of writing is as high as the Sumeru mountain, etc. Donc, here you see, we find something that is known also in Old Uyghur sources, that is stereotype poems of praise about the merit of writing. See, Letana or Leta Stava. See, and these pieces were composed certainly in advance, see, and could be inserted in colophons, and they could be reused in different words of pious content, you see, in various types of manuscripts, you see, that were offered to the monasteries by the Uyghur donors, and also by the Tocharian also. Then, see, one can also assume, you see, that for some time there were mixed Tocharian Uyghur families, you see, through alliances and marriage, you see, and then so there were some mutual assimilation, you see, of Uyghurs and Tocharians. So under number 15, you see, I give the restoration, you see, a translation of a dedicatory poem supposed to accompany an image of the Buddha. So it says, you see, I have painted the figure of the Buddha Lord, you see, I have ordered to paint. See that the donor who speaks, all sisters and brothers, you see, have joined me, you see, in this, and then you have a list. You see, this list is obviously a list of Uyghur names, you see, and then several of them are easy to identify. Some others are that's more controversial, you see, or more tentative. But we do find, beg, chore we find quite often, you see. Okay, and then we do find Alp, see, Arslan, and so on. You see, you see that has been studied by Zimmer, we see, in a paper that is not in my references, but that I have quoted elsewhere. You see, a series of papers about old Uyghur onomastic, but that it would be nice maybe to make again a survey of Uyghur onomastics, old Uyghur onomastics, see, from the point of view of the lexemes, you see, and also from the point of view of the formation of these names, a derivation of these names. As you know, of course, I don't need to tell you, you see, that every lexeme in Old Turkic, you see, and also in Old Uyghur, can be the basis of a name, you see. There will be always a motivation, you see. Okay, so I will not. I don't need to recall you that. But also these names are often complex, you see, and comprise a personal element and also titles, you see. So there is a relatively fuzzy limit between title and name properly. But that also will be interesting to investigate. So then I come now to the last section of my lecture. It is about the Buddhist vocabulary itself. As the Tocharians, you see, the Uyghur Buddhists elaborated a Buddhist vocabulary with a terminology in Uyghur. See? So they were not satisfied of simply borrowing Sanskrit terms through various channels, you see. So, and the available material has been also already covered, you see. And Jens Peter Laud has shown, you see, that there was a layer of transmission by Sogdian intermediary that goes back to the first acquaintance of the Uyghur with Buddhism. Actually, the Iranian-speaking missionaries, you see, that were Sogdians or Persian, played an important role, you see, in the whole Central Asia, you see. And this role was important among the Uyghurs, more than among the Tocharians, even though there are Tocharian technical terms of Buddhist content that go back also to Iranian sources. Then I show you here, you see, a list, which I don't need to comment in more detail, you see, of several technical words, you see, fundamental notions, you see, of Buddhism that have definitely Iranian source and which are not borrowed from Tocharian. See, that is shown clearly by the form. See, they were not borrowed from Tocharian, so that belonged to an older layer. So, to put it in other words, you see, it is evident, but I prefer to state it. The Tocharians, the Uyghurs, the Uyghur Buddhists were not converted by Tocharian missionaries. You see, that would be, they had already before, you see, before coming to the Tarim Basin, you see, they had, a part of them had acquaintance of Buddhism, and they were reached by Iranian missionaries. But once they arrived in the Yenki, alias Karasha region, you see, they were under strong influence of Tocharians. And Tocharian A, but also Tocharian B. But it has been also shown that under number 18 mined out, the most influential intermediary was a totalitarian A rather than totalitarian B. Okay, and then there was a phase, you see, but that has been already said, you see, that's there were several phases, but there was definitely a Yankee phase, Yankee or Karachar phase, you see, in the Al-Nidesha region. Okay, in the middle, after 840, you see, where the Uyghurs established here the capital of their Western kingdom. But later they moved, see, their capital city or cities, you see, further east. So there are several phases. Then, if one study in detail, you see now, the other several notions, you see, of the Buddhist terminology, one sees clearly that there have been definitely a strong totalitarian influence and totalitarian A influence on the Uyghur Buddhism. So it is shown by the list of the 10 courses of action, you see, Karmapata. So there are good courses of action, Kushala Karmapata, and bad ones, wrong ones, which have to be avoided. Then it is possible to reconstruct this full list in Sanskrit, of course, and also in totalitarian A, and even in totalitarian B. And I have put in this chart, you see, the old Uyghur correspondence, and this old Uyghur correspondence, which is perfectly established also, shows some kind of differentiated treatment, you see, of the sources. These old Uyghur terms were not translated directly from Sanskrit, and that corresponds to the general trend of the Uyghurs to explain, you see, to make things understandable by their audience. So they try to find some expression, you see, that speaks by themselves. And here one can see, you see, that the old Uyghur terms, which has action nouns, you see, with the suffix mak, muk, are parallel to a term resorting to the abstract suffix une. You see, we have tolune, earlier muk, see, kamlune, ogurla mak, etc. You see, on the contrary, where there is a simple term in totalitarian A, like smale, liar, see, lying, okay, there is also a single letsem in Old Uyghur, azug, etc. You see, that's twice tracking, and where lune, you see, is translated by sav sezlemek. Sav sezlemek, so is a phrase, you see, a fixed phrase, okay? You see, but we translate lune. So one sees, you see, clearly some pattern, you see, of translation, some kind of method of translation, you see, that is here documented. Then, if I, to conclude, you see, if I may open, see, I am close to the end of the lecture, I suppose. No? So then, judging from the comparison between the text, you see, the redaction of the Maitreya Samhitinataka and the Old Uyghur Maitre Simit, the Old Uyghur translator tried to render faithfully, but not slavishly, the totalitarian A text. So he understood the text that he translated, you see. Okay. And there is many variations. So, okay, see, it's not some kind of slavish or mechanical translation, as it can happen for other languages of Buddhism, you see. Here, one sees, you see, that the Old Uyghur translator does not translate always the same totalitarian phrase by the same Old Uyghur phrase. So it tries to adapt to the context. There are some discrepancies, which betray it as a partial misunderstanding of the totalitarian A text, because the totalitarian text was indeed difficult for the native speaker of a Turkish language, which has quite different structure, you see. This concerns especially the translation of the stanzas, the Tatarian text, you see, because you see, it is clear, you see, that the Old Widow translator or translators are troubled with the stanza, you see, because in the original Tatarian text, is the word order and choice of words actually had to comply with the meter, you see, and of course the translator transpose that in prose, and sometimes simply he does not understand, so he leaves out some element. Okay. Also, there is some variation, but not, I believe, not so dramatic between the Sandy Murtud version and the Rami version. So the one can reconstruct has been assumed an archetype, you see. So one should assume that this archetype has been translated from Tatarian. So the question now is when, when, probably that should be in 9th century, that there's no other reasonable hypothesis, you see. So in other words, you see, one can say that the translation of the Maitreya Samiti Nataka into Old Uyghur happened not so long after the ordering of copies of the text by Uyghur sponsor, you see, because it is quite striking that we should be grateful to Uyghur donors to have precisely sponsored this huge manuscript of Maitreya Samiti Nataka. Without Uyghurs, we would not have copies of this text, you see. And okay, then maybe there is only, I will say, 50 years, 2 generations, you see, between the archetype of the Old Uyghur Maitri Simit and the previous Maitreya Samiti Nataka. You see, because according to the paleography and the shape, the format of the manuscript, the Tatarian A text can be dated around 8th century, maybe a middle part or later part, you see, so before 9th century. But in any case, or at the edge of 8th and 9th century. So not so long before 840. Okay, now the Old Widow translators strive to convey the Buddhist message in a way which was easier to understand that. And then here one sees, you see, the difference of culture, you see, between the Old Widows and the Tatarians. The Tatarians were completely imbued, you see, by Buddhist culture, you see, by the Hindu Buddhist culture, but it was not the case with the Uyghurs. You see, the Uyghurs, basically, some of them were educated certainly and had some acquaintance with Buddhism, but basically they came from the steppes. See, and that was a large difference. There is an enormous difference with the Tatarian culture. You see, which had been for centuries. Which had been for centuries influenced by Indian culture, and the Tatarians lived in cities, or around in the oases, in the different oases around monasteries, but definitely in cities. You see, okay, that's a major difference also with the Uyghurs. Okay, so then, I think that's the last word that I may say for the moment. So I thank you again very much for your attention. Okay, and if I may answer some question and make some remarks, I will be happy with that. Okay, that's all. That's all.
Thank you very much, Professor Pinault. It was a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it personally. But before I propose my own question, I would like to give some room for the audience.